So the kind of point of the talk today is to discuss the kind of long-standing trend of dissent and activism in Ohio itself. I'll focus more specifically on Northeast Ohio to keep the focus kind of concise, because this would be a 15-week talk if I did all of Ohio. But I will focus on a sampling. There are only some people I'm going to focus on in some events, but just to kind of give us a sense of what the environment we live in is, right? There's something in the air here in Ohio that breathes activism, that breathes dissent, and we don't always talk about it. We hear about the things in the bigger cities, in Baltimore, New York, and Chicago, and places like this, but there's actually been a long history of people standing up for what's right here in our own neighborhoods and walking our own streets. Amanda had put this on the event page, and I actually liked it. I liked it enough to post it here because I think it's a good reason to explain what the point of this talk is, why we're here. She wrote, "The fruits of activism are fueled by the roots of connection that come from history and context. We seek to become rooted in and inspired by the spiritual goodness of our land and guided in our action by awareness of darkness and injustices of the past as we struggle together to build a future that is bright." So to prepare you, what I'm going to do is look at kind of several forms of ways that activism has taken form in Northeast Ohio over the years. Kind of first at the dark injustices and then the responses in each kind of thing. So we'll be looking at civil rights, we'll be looking at history of women's rights, looking at student activism, things like that. Kind of the dark side and the more inspirational side of both. So the background, right, Ohio's social ills have led to a long history of activism. For Akron, for a kind of case study example, the black population of Akron was relatively small at the beginning of the 20th century. There was only about 278 African Americans in Akron in 1880, rose to 525 by 1900. This is not a huge number for as big as Akron was at the time, but it began to rise really dramatically right after the turn of the century because of the rubber industry. Right, so in the beginning of the 20th century, a big, massive rubber boom, the opening of Goodyear, Firestone, things like this. Akron reaches a population of almost 6,000 blacks by 1920, settling in neighborhoods that were put aside for them. They were not allowed to move into the neighborhoods that were set aside for the white workers. Those ones like Goodyear Heights, those had housing restrictions. They wouldn't let African Americans move in there, just whites. So they were put into neighborhoods, the area of North Broadway, Cuyahoga Street, Furnace Street, right? A lot of these neighborhoods are still de facto segregated today, right? If you go through Goodyear Heights today or some of these other places in Akron, they are still predominantly poor white, while the areas around like Cuyahoga Street and Furnace Street are predominantly African American. Because of the long-standing history of not allowing them to move in, it has, even though the housing laws have been removed, there's still a tradition of this. Because of this rise in population that happened kind of drastically, whenever minorities move into a region and threaten, at least in the minds of the white majority in the region, threaten their kind of stability or their balance of power, it results in fears, usually like unfounded fears that somehow they are going to be displaced, they're going to lose their power, they're going to lose their position. So there's a lot of conflict that results. There was a race riot in 1900 that was because a young man named Lewis Peck was put in jail for kind of an unfounded threat of raping a white girl. The neighbors didn't believe that he did it. These huge crowd kind of gathered around the city hall, the courthouse, and the judge ended up ordering him to be moved out of Akron because Akron didn't have the police force to maintain peace during a time of disruption like this. So Peck was moved up to Cleveland, but even so, the people were incensed at this false holding, kind of imprisonment of a young black man, and they actually ended up attacking the city buildings and the courthouse, burning them to the ground during this. So as the black population increased in Akron, so too did the discrimination. There was lots of laws passed, actual laws on the law books that limited access to public facilities in the Akron area, housing restrictions, all of these things that we know happened in the Deep South. I think it's important to realize that these things were happening here too in Ohio. This is something that we, in Ohio history classes, we spend a lot of time talking about Jim Crow segregation and how bad it was in the South. We kind of just pretend like maybe, if we don't talk about that it happened here, maybe the kids will not know, right? But it absolutely did. In Akron, around this time then, because there is a new kind of racial dynamic emerging, we see this trend of this ideology called nativism that has been going around throughout all the colonies, actually, the European colonies, and especially in regions of the United States where post-slavery, a lot of the African Americans moved north to industrial towns to find jobs, to find work. And what happens is due to this change in dynamic of population, this ideology comes about called nativism, which is this theory that those who are native to the area have more claim, more power, and should be allowed to rule over, choose who lives where, who has what jobs, things like that. Of course, you realize that the whites were not native to this area, but they claim to be, right? This is 1900, they were born here or whatever. They are not considering people who are actually native. They are rejecting current wave of migration, right? So nativist claims were about white people who lived here for a generation or more, claiming that this is their land and they have control over who gets what in it. The kind of ugliest manifestation of the nativism that occurred at the time was in Akron. The Ku Klux Klan formed in 1921. This is something I learned in graduate school that I had never learned. I went to school here, I grew up here, I've been here my whole life, never heard this ever. But by the mid-1920s, the Klan's membership in Akron had grown to 52,000 members and was the largest Klan chapter in the United States. Wow. It had control of the mayor's office, the superintendent of schools, the county sheriff, the county prosecutor, the clerk of courts, 2 of the 3 county commissioners, 4 of the 7 seats on the Board of Education. Influence extended to the police department and the National Guard. So the KKK was no joke in Akron in the 1920s. They controlled much of the power structure.
Can you repeat that one more time? It's just...
Sure. So the Klan controlled, there's 52,000 members in Akron, right? They controlled the mayor's office, the superintendent. This means that like the mayor was an active Klans member, the superintendent was an active Klansman. The county sheriff, the county prosecutor, the clerk of courts, 2 of 3 county commissioners, 4 of 7 seats on the Board of Education, and influence in the police department and the National Guard. The Klan is a secret society. People did not necessarily know this at the time. In the 20s, they kept rosters, but the rosters were secret. We have since read them, right, in the years past. So we know this now because of like the dossiers that have come out keeping track of these people. They would have meetings, they would wear hoods and masks to mask their own identity, yeah. But we know now that the government was being primarily run by the Klan. So they controlled much of the power structure in all of Summit County, actually. So we have, like, this is Akron in the 1920s. We had these kind of parades that were, it's actually tons of pictures of this. If you want to see more of this, because it's shocking, right? Look at Akron Klan activity in the 20s. There are the Akron Centennial Parade right down Main Street. The women here made this float. This was a great sense of pride for these members, right? To be part of this kind of cleansing organization as they viewed it. It didn't happen without protest, though. The NAACP countered and formed a pretty strong organization here to counter Klan rallies, to counter Klan influence. So did the Akron Jewish community, the Young Men's Progressive Club, things like that. They had active counter-protests at these parades, at Klan meetings, at things like that, public activities. Okay. By the 1930s, you can see the Klan was really spread. The reason I showed this map especially is because the shock of how active the Klan was in Akron is usually because we have this myth here that the Klan was a Southern thing, right? And if you look, this is not true, right? You can see this is because the population is more sparse. That's why the chapters are spread out a little more. The membership was actually deeper in the South. There was more members. They just were more concentrated in these regions. But you can see there were Klan chapters especially concentrated around the urban areas. So you see them in Cleveland, in Chicago, Detroit, New York, things like that, all as a counter to this great migration of the workers that were moving into the industrial area. So then kind of fast forward recent years, this is not just the Klan membership, this is supposed to be hate groups in general, the membership. These are not, there's numbers on the screen you can't really see there, but it's how many hate groups there are in each of the states. So in Ohio today, like 2016, there are 34 registered hate groups. Some of these are Klan, registered. It's because they are registered groups that are identified by the U.S. government as hate groups, even though they're allowed to exist, right? This is
Is that today?
Yeah. This map is from today. This map was just done in like early 2016. They're not all Klan. Some of them are religious-based hate groups, things like that. They are groups that are have beliefs in separatist ideologies, things like that. They're allowed to do this. They're allowed to have groups. They're allowed to meet. This is part of the American dream, right? That they're allowed to do this. So they are, a lot of these are like registered nonprofits, right? They believe that they have a right to meet like this, and they do, right? So they get together and they talk about their shared experiences being, I don't know, they're fearful of being oppressed or something like that, whatever their problems are. This guy here was convicted in Akron of burning crosses on people's front yards and stuff just about 10 years ago. I had his name, but I don't have it now. So this is a recent picture, though. The cross burning is something that is not foreign to this region at all. I grew up in Parma, and I don't know how much you guys know about Parma itself. Parma is the largest suburb of a big city in the country, right? So your big cities like Atlanta, whatever, Dallas, they all have suburbs, but Parma is the largest suburb. It's a big, massive city. But if you've ever been there, it's almost entirely white, right? And by design, they do this on purpose there, and they're not ashamed of it. I can tell you in the 90s when I went to school, this was a case of a kid that a black family had moved into Parma, and he burned crosses on the front yard of this family. This is to tell them, because the Klan burned crosses, to basically say, we don't want you here, to try to intimidate them to leave. In my high school, I had a graduating class of over 3,000. I can remember one face that was light-skinned, but not quite white in my graduating class. Kids had worn red suspenders and red shoelaces. This was to let everybody else know where they stood. This is a sign of like neo-Nazi groups. So kids would walk around my high school in their red suspenders, their red shoelaces. This was a point of pride for them, right? So this is a struggle that, I guess the point of this is that this is a struggle we have not yet overcome, obviously, these hate groups and things like that. Let's see. The trend here in Parma itself, the federal government actually sued the city several times over its blatant housing discriminatory practices. In the 1970s, there was the president of the city council that stood up and said, we don't want these people living here in Parma, like at the city council meeting. There's a long-standing kind of history of that. The actual black population of Parma today is less than 2%, and there's kind of a joke with African Americans that live in the region, like if you have a tail light out or a headlight out or something like this, don't drive through Parma because they'll pull you over and you don't want to be pulled over in Parma, right? So it's something that's known locally to here, people that live there. Okay, so.
Question, since this is the history, why ICC is there then?
They're actually in Parma Heights and not Parma, which is actually a little bit different, tiny bit. They have a different governmental structure. I don't know that much about Parma Heights, honestly. When I went to high school, we had 3 high schools in the district, Parma, Normandy, and Valley Forge, which is in Parma Heights. And Valley Forge had a much higher minority population in Parma Heights than we did in Parma Senior. So I'm sure it has something to do with local governance not being quite as restrictive. Though I can't imagine, I would be interested to know, ICC probably got a lot of resistance, or gets a lot of resistance being there. I would imagine, knowing the demographic of the people around there, right? So this would be an interesting idea. Although Parma it's a migrant community. It's Slavs, it's Poles, it's Ukrainians. It's not necessarily it's lots of people that are, Eastern Europeans, things like this. It is a migrant community. There are a lot of big ornate, like Orthodox churches and things like that. It's more about a racial issue against Black people in Parma, with this kind of long-standing. This is really, I think, more the problem for Parma people than anybody else. So this is the dark, ugly side of all of that. Let's talk a little bit about them. In the region, what we have done, not that I am part of any of this, but we, the collective we, have done to counter some of these things. There was an active civil rights movement here in Akron. Many people view the civil rights movement as this struggle in the southern United States, but it was really much more than that. During the 50s and the 60s, African Americans in the northern part of the United States obviously experienced racism and discrimination. Maybe it's not always as oppressive as in the South. Like numbers of things like lynchings and that are much less in the North, but they occurred, right? So maybe not as bad, but I feel really uncomfortable putting a value figure on something like that. It was bad just for everybody, right? So they experienced a lot of the similar problems, right? Many whites and African Americans joined together to kind of fight against these things, joining things in the South like Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, like SNCC, or the Congress of Racial Equality Corps, by the activism being conducted in the South, and the Freedom Summer, where whites from the North rode buses to the South to kind of help with that. They learned a lot of things. They learned a lot of things about activism. They brought their ideas back up here and had their own movements to end equality in Ohio. So due to pressure from these civil rights activists, the state of Ohio did enact the Ohio Civil Rights Act of 1959, that we can see still remnants of this. A lot of times you'll see like Ohio is equal opportunity employer, does not deny on the basis of race, religion, color, creed, things like this. This comes out of these activists that fought against that discrimination. The actual language of the Civil Rights Act is to prevent and eliminate the practice of discrimination against persons because of their race, color, religion, national origin, or ancestry. The Civil Rights Act guarantees all people fair access to public facilities and private businesses. And it also established the Ohio Civil Rights Commission as the actual people on the ground to enforce this discrimination. The commission, when it was first enacted, conducted a study of discriminatory practices within the state and discovered, shockingly, that minority groups were commonly denied jobs and access to businesses, restaurants, bowling alleys, hotels, other establishments, things like that. So what they were tasked with doing was enforcing the Civil Rights Act, enforcing this act that guaranteed people all access. By shutting down businesses, fining businesses, things like that. What the organizations did, many of them, and you actually still see a lot of these today. We can talk about them in more detail later if you want to know which ones to avoid. But a lot of the businesses that were open to the public changed to members-only private facilities just so that they didn't have to follow Civil Rights Commission rulings, right? So a lot of public facilities became private, even with a nominal admissions fee or something like this. It just basically had to do with an admissions process to let you in. Was designed to allow white people to continue to gather together without having anybody else in their mix. One of the most kind of effective groups, the United Freedom Movement, actively protested school segregation in Cleveland in the 1960s and 70s. You guys, I'm sure, have all heard at some point of the 1954 case, the Brown versus the Board of Education. This is supposed to be the case that started the civil rights movement, that ruled that separate schools for whites and African Americans were unconstitutional. The Brown case was in response to the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which said that facilities that were separate were fine as long as they were equal. But under the Brown versus the Board of Education case, it was determined that you cannot have separate and equal, that you're always going to be pushing inequality when you separate like that. So remember then, Brown versus Board is 1954. In 1963, a study of Cleveland schools showed that 93% of elementary schools were still segregated, 78% of middle schools, and 83% of high schools. So in all of those, these kids attended either all white or all black schools in the majority of Cleveland, right, 9 years after Brown v. Board, when they were supposed to be desegregating. To try to fix this under the pressure from the civil rights groups like the United Freedom Movement, the Cleveland School Board implemented in the mid-1960s a idea of busing, basically where they would take the kids from the poor neighborhoods, put them on buses, send them to the white neighborhoods to go to school, and vice versa, to kind of force integration into schools. It didn't work at all, because what happened was when the black kids would arrive in the white schools, they would just be put in separate classrooms, and they would still be separate facilities. They would still not be attending any kind of, they didn't have lunch with them. They set up separate lunch times, separate like recess times, things like that. So they were in the same building, but still completely segregated. When new textbooks were ordered, they went to the white kids, and then the black kids got the old textbooks, like this kind of thing. So it was segregated, but still in the same building.
That refers when the white kids went to the black school.
So this was what happened there. Similar, they would put the white kids into their own classrooms, but actually not that many white kids ended up going to the black schools, because the ones that were ordered to go, their parents ended up putting them in private schools. Yeah, so they fought, like the parents just wouldn't do it. They found other ways around doing it. A lot of them would choose to homeschool instead or something like that, because it was, they knew the conditions of these schools and these neighborhoods, they were falling apart. This is because the way that we pay for schools in Ohio is based on local property taxes. And so if you are living in an area that is impoverished, your schools are not going to have the amount of funding that the other kids do, so it kind of creates division anyway. So the kids that are living in a place that is, a wealthy neighborhood, their parents don't want them going to the other schools, because they're fully aware of the fact that those kids don't have textbooks, and those kids don't have supplies, and the roof is leaking, and the teachers aren't being paid, and this kind of thing. So they, most of the time, did not actually send them there. So it wasn't so much of an issue the other way. So obviously busing did not end it. So the United Freedom Movement kept working towards trying to actually create a policy that desegregated schools and provided more fairness in education. The group itself consisted primarily of African American women in Cleveland. No surprise there, ladies, right? And what the women did was to kind of force the hand of the local governments, to kind of force them to act in a more fair way, was they helped unite all of these other civil rights organizations in Cleveland to kind of create a stronger voice, a louder voice, a bigger force with which to argue with them, including the NAACP and CORE, right, who had come up into Cleveland to establish their own roots there. The ultimate goal of this big group, this conglomerate, was to create a school district with no segregation of any kind. They did this by picketing the schools, the segregated schools, picketing the Board of Education, submitting petitions to city schools and leaders, this kind of thing. We see often, right, we're always struggling. I know this group, I'm sure, has asked itself or asked each other lots of times, like, how do we make meaningful change? Sometimes we feel like the things that we do aren't doing anything, like, is our signing petitions doing anything? Is our doing little parts here and there, is it actually doing anything? We fail to see the fruits of our labor. But they do, it just takes time, right? So for example, with the United Freedom Movement, with their petitioning, with their gathering things together, these things in and of themselves did not change policy, but what they did was create enough awareness and enough noise and enough backing behind it that when the time came, in 1973, there was a major legal battle known as Reed versus Rhodes, where an African-American mother, empowered by this movement that had been spreading through Cleveland, sued the Cleveland Board of Education. And the judge in the case ruled that the Cleveland schools were illegally segregated, and officials must implement programs to desegregate educational facilities and opportunities in the city. So there was a massive kind of push then, after the mid-1970s, to actively desegregate the schools, spread the wealth, right, things like that. However, anybody who's been in Cleveland recently today, they made progress, right? They did push it. They did achieve this victory with this court case. They had some kind of small-term gains. The schools were getting better, but in today's present kind of partisan political climate, Cleveland is becoming largely segregated again, largely because of new redistricting of schools and kind of where they're placing kids now based on neighborhoods and relative incomes of households and things like that. It's becoming largely segregated and unequal again. So here at the start of the 21st century, the neighborhoods are still not integrated. There's still kind of de facto segregation, even though, like I said, it's the same thing in Akron, even though the housing policies prohibited, even though there are laws, even though the schools are actively prohibited from segregating, it's just happening anyways based on the structuring of the school zones and things like that. So what needs to happen now is some kind of active push to rethink that whole setup, right, in order to kind of give these kids a more fair chance. We also have in this area kind of pioneers. Sojourner Truth we'll talk about in a minute when I get to talking about the women's movement. But Sojourner Truth is not actually from Akron, but she gives a very famous speech in Akron, which kind of becomes like I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. Like
rallying cry or something?
Yeah, like a rallying cry for the women's rights crossover with the civil rights movement, right? So this was done here. Kind of also interesting if you consider how important sports are in this region. Fritz Pollard and Bobby Marshall do become the first black NFL players. It's not the NFL yet, first black pro football players. They play for the Akron Pros, who win the national championship in 1920. And Fritz Pollard actually goes on to become the first African-American NFL coach, right? So, and they're all from this area. We also see not everybody is evil and bad. Not all white people are bad. This is B.F. Goodrich had a policy of trying to incorporate more minorities into their kind of employment structure, right? So they had held rallies and marches, things like this. This says all 24 nationalities of the B.F. Goodrich Company. You can see that people that are marching here are black and white marching together to kind of raise awareness that other businesses in the area were still extraordinarily segregated. They were making an effort not to be, not that they weren't. Goodrich was hiring a lot of African Americans. They were not being hired into management positions or anything like this, but they were making what they felt to be more efforts than some of the others in the area. So this March for Equality is maybe a social activism march, maybe it's a business tactic to make them look better against other businesses in the area. There were demonstrations against police brutality and violence. I don't feel like I really need to explain this much because we fully understand this in 2016. but there was a lot of discriminatory practices, a lot of racial violence carried out by police officers against African Americans in Cleveland and in Akron. In 1968, there were some very famous, if you ask the establishment, they call them riots. I like the word demonstration better. It feels a little better than riot. Some really massive demonstrations in 1968 due to police brutality. This lasts for 6 days before the National Guard is brought in to put it down. But this kind of long-standing trend of taking it to the streets, right, has been there in Akron and in Cleveland. And I have here, this is just a little, really quick, brief interview of somebody who was there for the Huff Riots demonstrations in Cleveland. I hope the sound is loud enough.
I was actually going to bring this topic up. Exciting, but scary too. You know, a lot of people got hurt. There was a lot of destruction that was going on. And it was all inside your own neighborhood. You know, was it good? You say to some extent, but to the other extent, no, wasn't good, you know, because it hurt more to your own neighborhood than it did good, you know, but some of the living conditions, you know, they were bad, you know, but you had to tear down something in order to get something built back up, so.
What I want to talk about at the end, my kind of question for this part, is I really like that statement he makes with the question is it good? He says you have to tear down something to bring it back up. I think what we need to discuss if we want to be kind of activist, forward-thinking people that want to affect change is what would make people burn their own neighborhoods to the ground, right? What level of discrimination would they have to be subject to? What kind of desperation would their lives have to be subject to? And what can we do to ameliorate that before it comes to that place? Is there things that we can do, right? Because maybe there is and maybe there isn't, and that's what I'd like to talk about later. If there's something that we, as a group of forward-thinking people, can do to kind of help this kind of thing, or not. And I'd really like to kind of put a pin in that and come back to it, this particular thing, because you can see the images, the destruction there. And he says it's exciting and it had to be done, but at the same time it was scary and it was destructive. And so was there another way? Was this the only way? What was, you know, this kind of thing? So we'll come back to that in a minute. The other form of activism, aside from race-based civil rights activism, is Akron is a kind of breeding ground for women's rights. The Akron hosts the 1851 Women's Rights Convention, where Sojourner Truth gives her famous Ain't I a Woman speech, which you guys have the text of here. Just to give you a little background on Sojourner Truth herself, to kind of understand the speech a little better. She was born a slave in 1797. Like I said, she's not from Ohio, but she was spent her early childhood in New York, owned by a Dutch American. Like other slaves, she had the miseries of being sold, cruelly beaten, mistreated. Around 1815, she fell in love with a fellow slave, but they were forced apart. She instead was forced to marry a slave that she didn't know very well named Thomas, who she bore 5 children. Her master had promised to free her to uphold, there's a new New York anti-slavery law in 1827. He didn't do it, so she ran away, or as she later informed us all, she did not run away, she just walked away by daylight. This is very typical kind of Sojourner Truth speech. She's like, I didn't run, I just left, right? I was out. She experienced a religious conversion. She became Christian in 1843, became an itinerant preacher, changed her name to Sojourner Truth, and it was during this time that she became really active in a growing anti-slavery movement as well as a growing kind of women's rights movement. So what's really interesting about Sojourner Truth herself is she kind of represents this intersection of the two movements. So at the 1851 convention in Akron, she delivered what is now recognized as one of the most famous abolitionist and women's rights speeches in American history. Ain't I a Woman, which we'll watch a rendition here.
In 1851, the black abolitionist and former slave Sojourner Truth spoke to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio. The spontaneous speech, only a few minutes long, was a landmark moment in feminist and abolitionist history.
Well, children, where there is so much rapping, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talk about rights, the white men gonna be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as any man when I could get it. And I could bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, seen most sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? And they talk about this thing in the head. What is it they call it? Oh, that's right there, intellect. That's it, honey. Well, and y'all holds a court. Wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? That man in the back there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? He came from God and a woman. Man didn't have nothing to do with it. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down, all alone, well, these women here together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And they ask him to do it. The men better let him.
That's it. So obviously you can see through this speech how it can become a major talking point about this. Like, wait, I'm a woman too, right? Even though she is subject to what we call double jeopardy, right? Being both black and woman, right? The double form of discrimination in the United States that really can't be underestimated, right? The things that black women have to overcome, being subject to both forms of discrimination. She really kind of perfectly, I think, encapsulates it there. And this continues. I think this feeling continues even in the post-slave era, even in the 21st century. Women are still feeling, black women are still feeling whenever we're talking about the rights of women or the way women are treated or something like that. I think oftentimes black women are not feeling like as though they are the ones being spoken about. So this is another kind of continuous issue. I have on the back of your page there, Gloria Steinem is from Ohio. She was one of the most prolific and famous kind of feminist writers from the 1970s into today. I have just kind of a selection of little sound bite quotes from Gloria Steinem. The first there, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. That's true. I thought maybe actually we could go around and everybody could read one. I read the first one because it had a bad word in it myself, but the other ones are all clean, so you guys can go around the room and read them without feeling guilty. But yeah. Let's start with you.
All right. The second one is power can be taken, not given. The process of the taking is empowerment in itself.
So each one of these, I think we could talk about for like 10 minutes. So really let them sink in what she's saying.
The first problem for all of us, men and women, is not to learn, but to unlearn.
Law and justice are not always the same. When they aren't, destroying the law may be the first step towards changing.
We need to remember across generations that there is as much to learn as there is much to teach.
It is more rewarding to watch money change the world than to watch it accumulate.
A feminist is anyone who recognizes the equality and full humanity of women and men.
If the shoe doesn't fit, must we change the foot?
The art of life is not controlling what happens to us, but using what happens to us.
Self-esteem isn't everything, it's just that there's nothing without it.
Women have always been an equal part of the past. We just haven't been a part of history.
When unique voices are united in a common cause, they make history.
I believe that change comes from the bottom, not the top.
The future depends entirely on what each of us do every day. Of movement is only people moving.
Clearly no one knows what leadership has gone undiscovered in women all the races, and in Black and other minority men.
And this was just some I found, right? She's one of the most prolific writers ever. You can find scores of books and articles. She still is pretty active today. But I like Gloria Steinem for especially her kind of thought-provoking small statements, right? Especially the ones where she's doing this intersection of like race and gender. This last one, no one knows what leadership has gone undiscovered in women of all races and in Black and other minority men, right? Because their voices have been silenced. This is the argument she's getting at there, is that if we only could hear the voices or have allowed people to speak up and given them the chance to lead, who knows what kind of leaders they could have been. None of us do. Change coming from the bottom, not the top, is huge. Actually, every one of them. I could go through each one of these ones, but I'm not going to. We can talk about if you have any ones that you really want to get at. I'm almost done here, actually. After a few more things I want to show you, we can come back and discuss them, because I think that some of these are really good kind of little motivators to keep us going when we're feeling like maybe we aren't quite being as effective as we need to be. In this kind of long-standing tradition of writers, artists, things like that, we have songwriters, poets, singers, things like that. And Tracy Chapman, as a Cleveland native, being again both Black and woman, addresses these intersections really beautifully. So I have two songs here that I gave you the lyrics to. One that addresses specifically gender issue, I guess, with Behind the Wall. And the other one, Across the Lines, which is much more racial in nature. These are good for looking at what a local person, somebody from here who grew up here, grew up in Cleveland, her perspective on these kind of social situations. I changed. Trying to press play here.
Last night I heard the screaming, loud voices behind the walls. Another sleepless night for me. It won't do no good to call the police. Always come late if they come at all. Last night I heard the screaming, loud voices behind the wall. Another sleepless night for me. It won't do no good to call the police. always come late if they come at all. And when they arrive, they say they can't interfere with domestic affairs between a man and his wife. And as they walk out the door, the tears well up in her eyes. Last night I heard the screaming, then the silence that chilled my soul. Prayed that I was dreaming when I saw the ambulance in the road, and the policeman said, I'm here to keep the peace. Will the crowd disperse? I think we all could use some sleep. Last night I heard the screaming, loud voices behind the wall. Another sleepless night for me, it won't do no good to call the police. Always come late if they come at all. Across the lines, who would dare to go under the bridge, over the tracks, separate white from black, choose sides, run for your lives. Tonight the riots began. On back streets of America, they kill the dream of America. Little black girl gets assaulted, ain't no reason why. News runs the story and raises tempers. My next day it starts to riot, knives and guns are drawn. Two boys get killed, one white boy goes by. Across the lines, who would dare to go under the bridge, over the tracks, separates white from black, choose sides, run for your lives. Tonight the riots began. On back streets of America, they killed the dream of America. Little black girl gets assaulted, no one know her name. Lots of people hurt and angry, she's the one to blame. Across the lines, who would dare to go under the bridge, over the tracks, separates whites from blacks, choose sides, run for your lives. Tonight the riots began. On back streets of America, they killed the dream of America.
When I was looking for Tracy Chapman videos, I had to get one that really showed her face, because she, if you were watching, the expression on her face is a woman who knows what she's singing about, right? It's not just something you can just get from the lyrics. The lyrics are powerful, but watching her sing it is really good. So I definitely want to talk more about this too in a minute. There's two more. The second to last kind of form of tradition of activism we have in this area. I think we're much more familiar with this one. We kind of understand Kent State's tradition. We all know, anybody that's from here has been here for a month or two, typically has heard about Kent State's protests on campus or things like that. I'm sorry? That, you know, if clowns come onto Kent State's campus, the students will chase them. You don't mess with Kent State students, right? There's a long tradition, but at Kent State and also at Akron, and so I have one last video. It's really well done. This is about May 4th, just to give us some background. And it has images in here. I've been living in Kent for a long time. I've never seen some of these pictures. What I really love about Kent State in and of itself is that this did not like scare Kent State students against speaking up against things that are wrong. It fueled them to continue to be active, to stand up for what Berkeley, as a place where students come to Kent from all over the country on their reputation for being a school where you can speak your mind, where you can kind of stand up for what's right. It did not deter, and you still can today find your cause relatively easily at Kent State. And if you can't find your cause, you can make your own group and get students behind you to help you work with it. It's really good environment for that. And same in Cleveland in recent years, we have this sentiment that has continued, right? The sentiment of standing up against injustice. People are in Cleveland taking to the streets in numbers, as we saw with the Tamir Rice case, as we saw with the RNC protests. Cleveland has been doing it in a way that's really interesting. It's fascinating to me that Cleveland demonstrations have been going off largely without incident, which is really different than some of the other cities. I'd be interested to see what you guys think about that, right? Everybody was kind of shocked at the peaceful nature of the RNC protests, and I think that sociologists are still kind of trying to look at why that was. Everybody thought Cleveland was going to burn that weekend, and it didn't. And I think we're not sure yet, right, exactly what or how the Cavs, victory thing, how millions of people were able to flood the streets and basically go home, right, without incident. What is it about Cleveland that allows people to gather together in such mass numbers and do it peacefully, right? Is this a good thing, or is it something that means that we're not doing enough, right? This is an interesting kind of debate, right? We also see the college students continuing this. This was in the newspaper from Friday. So at Akron's homecoming game, a large group of the students chose to sit during the national anthem and protest the police brutality as has been going on around the country. So this was just this past weekend. This was earlier this year. Stole this off the North's Facebook page. But student, projects on campus, right? There are still a lot of students that are really passionate about right versus wrong, and continuing in this long-standing tradition we have in this area, right, of standing up for what's right and of kind of countering our social ills, right? So the last thing quickly I'm going to go through is the one other thing in Northeast Ohio that is really that a lot of people don't know about, is there's a tradition of people in Northeast Ohio over the last 200 years who have attempted to create their own utopian communities. There has been several groups that have tried to create their own kind of neighborhoods, environments entirely separate from what they see as a problematic American society. So some believe that the American society was too corrupt to even be reformed. So if you cannot reform it from within, they decided to separate, form their own societies. This happened all around the world, but there were actually at least 21 communal societies in Ohio in the 19th and into the 20th century. Religious societies were the most successful, like the Shakers. The Zorrites were a group of German separatists that moved to create their own kind of communal society. These were all based on like utopian socialism. So they were communities that self-existed, kind of self-sustained themselves, separate from the national government or separate from like interference from the outside world. So everybody had jobs, everybody had roles, they had their own gatherings, everybody, like communal storehouses for food, things like that. So this idea that they could build a utopia, that they could bring people together to create an environment that allowed people to grow and spiritually and to survive together without all of the corruption, without all of the bad kind of outside influence, has a long-standing tradition in Ohio, religious and secular communities. So I don't know, maybe we have future utopian communities. I don't know, maybe this is something we could think about, creating societies where we
starting in Madinah, right?
Can, right, where we can all live together and build communal libraries and things like this, so we can all share books and ideas. So I guess the big question then to conclude on is how can we follow the tradition that exists here in our community? How can we continue the trend, follow these roots of activism that it's in the very soil that we walk on here, right? So we can greet, we can feed, we can pray, right? Hallie, can you read the Arabic, or is it too small in there for the hadith? Closer.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. حدثنا مسلم ابن إبراهيم حدثنا شعبة حدثنا سعيد بن أبي بردة عن أبيه عن جده عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال على كل مسلم صدقة. وقالوا يا نبي الله فمن لم يجد؟ قال يعمل بيده فينفع نفسه ويتصدق. قالوا فإن لم يجد؟ قال يعين ذا الحاجة الملهوف. قالوا فإن لم يجد؟ قال فليعمل بالمعروف وليمسك عن الشر فإنها له صدقة.
Could you read the English?
You're
the closest.
Every Muslim has to give in charity. Narrated Abu Burda from his father, from his grandfather, that the Prophet ﷺ said, every Muslim has to give in charity. The people asked, O Allah's Prophet, if someone has nothing to give, what will he do? He said he should work with his hands and benefit himself and also give in charity from what he earns. The people further asked, if he cannot find even that, he replied, he should help the needy who appeal for help. Then the people asked, if he cannot do that, he replied, then he should perform good deeds and keep away from evil deeds, and this will be regarded as charitable deeds.
So how can we follow the tradition here? As Muslims, we can use the principles we have, already in Islam. We can follow the Sunnah of our Prophet. We know we have the instructions for how to continue, for what we're supposed to do in the face of evil, right? How we're supposed to respond, how we're supposed to react. And we also have here in Madinah, right? We have something really unique and something special in this group. We have the tools, we have the people, we have the collective brain power and creativity, and we have been doing a great job, right? This group has been doing a really fantastic job at, I think, beginning to affect social change, right? So we need to just continue this, right? Keep the wheels in motion, don't tire, right? Keep pushing on forward and keep going, inshallah. Aside from Madinah, not to take away from Madinah, maybe this is other things that Madinah could become involved in or whatever, but there are lots of local activist movements, opportunities for service, things like that, that are lots of places you can go to get involved, ways you can serve. This is just kind of like quick off the top of my head. If you have any more that you know about, please share. But we do have a few that I know that Madinah people are involved in, and then some other ones that I know could really use some help. I know Town Hall 2 in Ravenna is really desperate for crisis helpline workers. The crisis helpline is for people that are the suicide helpline for women that are victims of domestic violence that need help, right? People just to answer the calls and do intake for these people. They have been actively posting in all the volunteer boards that they really need people. So if this is something you feel like you could do, that's definitely a good way to kind of continue this tradition of helping. And I guess what we can do is I have two related pieces to use for Quran reflection. I'll share those. We can reflect on the Quran and comments, questions, things. We'll just kind of open up for discussion then from there. Okay, so first,